A woman with skin like wet paper stood on the surface of the sea and watched me. The boat was old, a rusted metal beast that groaned under the weight of the salt air. I sat on a metal bench in the middle of the deck, my hands gripped tightly around the edges of the seat. The engine hummed with a heavy, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of my boots and up into my chest. It was the only sound other than the slapping of waves against the hull. For hours, I had sat in silence as we moved away from the island where my family lived and toward the mainland. I wanted to be home. I wanted to be safe. The journey across the water usually took 2 hours, but the ferry felt slower today, as if it were struggling against a heavy current that was not visible on the surface. I looked out at the expanse of the Visayas waters. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only a bruised purple and deep indigo in the sky. The water was flat and oily looking. It seemed to stretch forever in every direction. I felt small, a single speck of life on a vast, indifferent plain. I looked toward the front of the boat where the man sat at the wheel. He did not look back. He never spoke. He was just a silhouette against the dim glow of the cabin lights. His hands were steady on the wheel, his face hidden in shadows. I had seen other passengers before, people who would trade stories or share snacks during the long crossing, but tonight there was only me and him. The isolation was thick enough to taste, like salt on my lips. Then the figures appeared. At first I thought they were rocks jutting out of the water, but as we moved past them they became distinct. 1, then 5, then 20. They were standing on top of the waves, perfectly still. They did not bob with the motion of the swells. They stayed upright like pillars. They were draped in heavy, old clothes, thick cotton and linens that appeared sodden and weighted down by something thick. I sat up straight, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I squinted into the darkness. They were not moving. They were simply standing there in the water, spaced out in rows as if they were waiting for something. As we drifted closer, I could see their faces. They were pale, almost white, and their eyes stayed fixed on me. I stood up, my knees shaking. I could see dozens of them now, stretching across the horizon. They were dressed in styles that looked decades old, men in heavy trousers and caps, women in long skirts and veils that clung to their faces. Their skin had a gray, washed-out tone, like something left out in the sun too long until all the color drained away. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and the smell of old fish and stagnant water filled my nose. The woman who had first appeared was closest to the starboard side. She stood just a few yards from the edge of the boat. Her hair was long and matted with weeds that clung to her scalp like seaweed. She did not move her lips, but she seemed to be watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I turned toward the man at the helm. I wanted him to see them. I wanted him to scream or turn the boat around or do anything other than sit there in silence. "Can you see them?" I whispered, my voice cracking. It was the first time I had spoken since we left the dock. The man did not move. He did not even flinch. His hands remained steady on the wheel. He did not turn his head toward the figures in the water. It was as if he were ignoring their presence entirely, or perhaps he was simply used to them. I moved toward him, my feet heavy on the metal deck. Each step felt like a struggle against an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. I reached the front of the boat and grabbed the railing near his seat. "They are in the water," I cried out, my voice louder now. "There are dozens of them. They are standing on the waves. We have to turn back." He did not answer. He just stared ahead at the dark line of the mainland. I looked back over my shoulder. The figures were closer now. The ferry was moving slowly, and those who had been in the distance were drifting toward us. They were still silent, their faces frozen in expressions of profound longing. Some had holes where their eyes should have been. Others had mouths stretched open as if they were caught in a permanent scream that no sound could escape. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense. It was not just that they were there. It was that they seemed to be waiting for the boat to stop. They were not moving toward me by their own will. They were simply waiting for the ferry to reach its destination so they could join it. The thought made my lungs tighten. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The boat was a small island of metal in a sea of ghosts. I sank back down onto my bench, pulling my knees toward my chest. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, but the sound of the water against the hull felt like it was coming from beneath me as well. It sounded heavy, like stones being dragged across the bottom. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, but the clock on the dashboard only seemed to tick forward a few minutes at a time. The air grew thick and humid, tasting of brine and rot. Every time I opened my eyes, the figures were closer. They moved with a slow, drifting motion, their bodies swaying slightly as if they were being pulled by invisible strings under the surface. The only thing that kept me from screaming was the steady, rhythmic thrum of the engine. It was a constant, a heartbeat for the boat. Finally, the ground beneath my feet began to vibrate differently. The hull groaned with a deeper, more metallic protest. The shape of land appeared on the horizon, not as a silhouette, but as a solid, jagged mass. We were approaching the port. As we drew closer to the pier, the figures in the water did not move toward us anymore. They simply stayed where they were, fading into the gloom of the shoreline. One by one, their forms seemed to dissolve into the spray and the shadows of the docks. The boat slowed. The engine gave a final, shuddering groan before it cut out entirely. The silence that followed was deafening. It was so quiet I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I sat on the deck until the gangplank was lowered. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely grip the railing. A man stood at the end of the pier, his face illuminated by a single hanging bulb. He wore a heavy orange vest and held a flashlight. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and pity. "You made it," he said. His voice was raspy as if he had not used it in days. I hopped off the boat, my legs feeling like jelly. I collapsed onto the pier, gasping for air. The man walked over to me, his boots clumping on the wood. "You were out there a long time," he said. "The ride from the island is usually much shorter." I looked back at the ferry. It sat in the water like a hollow shell. I could still see the figures standing in the water behind it. They were not fading, they were waiting. I turned to the man in the orange vest. "That ferry," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Who operates it?" He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Nobody," he said. "That route was shut down 2 years ago. A storm rolled in and the ferry capsized. Everyone on board drowned, all 37 passengers and the captain." My blood turned to ice. Then who was driving the boat tonight? The man looked past me toward the water. His flashlight beam swept across the pier and landed on the spot where the ferry had been. The water was empty. The boat was gone. There was nothing there but black water and the faint smell of something rotting. "I need to ask you something," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How did you get on that ferry? The dock has been closed since the accident. There is no ticket booth, no schedule, nothing." I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. I thought about the figures standing on the water. I thought about their clothes, soaked and heavy. I thought about the woman with weeds in her hair and the way she had watched me with those hollow, empty eyes. I looked down at my hands. They were still trembling. My shirt was damp, and when I touched the fabric, it smelled of salt and something deeper, something like the bottom of the sea. The man took a step back. His eyes were wide now, and the flashlight shook in his hand. "Your clothes," he whispered. "They are wet." I looked down. He was right. My shirt, my pants, my shoes, everything was soaked through as if I had been standing in the water for hours. I had not noticed it before. I had been so focused on getting off the boat that I had not felt the cold seeping into my skin. I looked back at the empty water where the ferry had been. The figures were gone. The sea was calm and still, as if nothing had happened, but I could still hear the lapping of the water against the hull. I could still feel the vibration of the engine in my bones. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface, I could hear the faint sound of a woman humming a tune I had never heard before, a tune that sounded like it was meant for someone who had already drowned. "Do you think the dead remember the living, or do they simply wait for us to join them?"